We've been talking about learning to think the way that God thinks, the way He teaches us to think. We've talked about how to think about God. We've talked about how to think about ourselves and about others. And tonight I want to talk about how to think about animals. This may seem like a little bit of a strange thing to talk about, but the Bible talks about it. And so God does guide our thinking about how we should interact with and treat animals. And today I want to look at some of those passages. The first thing I want us to understand, and I think most people do understand this, but I know some people who don't, mankind is more valuable than animals. As much as we may love different animals, they are not up to the value or the worth of a human being. Even if you don't like that human being, they are still worth much more than any animal or many animals. In Genesis chapter 1, all the way back at creation, we find in verse 26 through 28 that it says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So right at the beginning, we see that God gave man authority over animals. He is to rule the animals, have dominion over them, over every type of animal, whether it's fish or birds or cattle or insects. All of it is under the authority of man, and that's every man and woman. It's mankind is to rule over animals. In Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, in verses 1 through 5, it says, "So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, and on all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I shall require the life of man." So he tells us two things here. Well, more than two, but two things we're going to notice. He says that all the animals are given into the hand of mankind, that every moving thing that lives shall be food for us. As far as I understand it, before this, man was not eating meat, or at least did not have the authority from God to eat meat. When you go back to Adam and Eve, they were given the plants to eat. But now he's giving animals to eat as well. But he says you must not eat blood. And then he says if a human being is killed, your lifeblood, then there must be a reckoning. If an animal kills a man, he requires it from the animal. In other words, the animal should be put to death if it kills a human being. And the same thing is true. If a human being kills another human being, they are also to be put to death, if you keep reading in that context. And so it is okay to kill and eat animals, but it is absolutely not okay to kill a human being when we talk about it in the context of murder. In executing judgment, that's another story. All right, Matthew chapter 12, Jesus talks about the value of man and animals. And in verses 11 and 12, he says, Then he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. It was against the law of the Sabbath to carry a burden on the Sabbath day. And yet they understood that a sheep, if it falls into a pit, it's in trouble, it needs help. You can help it on the Sabbath day. You can lift it out of the pit. Unfortunately, they didn't apply that thinking to helping man. And so he says, well, man is even more valuable than the sheep. And so you should understand, if you can do it for a sheep, you can do it for a fellow human being. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. You just don't understand the point of the Sabbath. But man is more valuable than the animals. In Luke chapter 12, verse 24, he says, Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which have neither storehouse nor barn, and God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And again in verses 6 through and 7 of Luke 12, he says, Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 copper coins? And not one of them is forgotten before God. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. So Jesus says God cares about the animals. He knows about what's happening with them, with every single sparrow. Every single bird flying around, God knows exactly what it's doing, where it's going. He cares about them. He made them. But he values us more than many sparrows. So animals are not as valuable as man. But animals are still valuable, and they are worthy of care. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, in verse 4, he says, You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him lift them up again. Now, this may have more to do with love for your brother in helping him with this problem that he has with his animal falling down. But you still get the idea that the animal is not to be just left and ignored when it's fallen under a load or having a problem. It's supposed to be helped. In Jonah, the book of Jonah, you remember Jonah did not want God to be merciful to Nineveh. He wanted God to destroy it, but because the people repented, God did not destroy it at that time. And he was angry about this, and so God is explaining to Jonah the proper way of thinking. And in Jonah 4, in verse 11, God says, And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and much livestock? So, as I understand it, this is talking about children, those who can't discern between their right and their left. I know many adults can't do that either, but I don't think that's God's point here. But he also says there's much livestock there. And so he pities the city because of the livestock. He does not want to destroy them. God cares about these animals. Even though he cares more about the people, he also cares about the animals. In John 10, in verse 11 through 13, Jesus is comparing himself to a shepherd. But what he says is he's explaining something about how shepherds work. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. But a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. So he says now, if you have someone who's just hired to watch these sheep, well, he's not going to risk his life to save the sheep. He's just going to run away when there's danger. But the good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Now, generally, they're not wanting to actually die, but they are risking their life in order to save the sheep, so they may end up dying. Of course, with Jesus, he literally gave his life. He intentionally died for the sheep to save us. But what he says about the shepherd is true even in reality, in the way that shepherds actually work. We see that with David in 1 Samuel 17 when he's explaining why he can go up against Goliath. In verse 34 and 35, but David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it." I don't know too many people who would actually be willing to do that, to go up against a lion or a bear and fight it hand to hand. He catches it by its beard. I don't know too many people who would be willing to do that in order to save an animal. But David was a good shepherd, and he did. He cared for those animals. He protected them. Now, of course, the lion and the bear are also animals. So that's another consideration here. He's killing them because he is mankind. He rules over them. When they're taking what belongs to him, that's not okay. You don't just let them take it because they're animals. You can rule over them, and you can even kill them. All right. In Ezekiel 34, we're not going to read all of this, but here again, he's using shepherding as a comparison to something. And here he's talking to the leaders of Israel, calling them the shepherds of Israel in verses 1 through 6. But there in verse 2, he says, "Woe to the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks?" And in verse 4, "The weak you have not strengthened, nor have you healed those who were sick, nor bound up the broken, nor brought back what was driven away, nor sought what was lost. But with force and cruelty you have ruled them." And so, yes, he's talking here about people rather than literal sheep and shepherds. But this is a picture of bad shepherds. Right? A bad shepherd does not take care of his sheep. A good shepherd does take care of his sheep. He does not use force and cruelty with his animals. In Matthew chapter 18, in verse 12, more on this idea of Jesus being the shepherd. He says, "What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one that is straying?" Now, he's not saying that's nobody would ever do that. He's saying that would be the normal thing for the shepherd to do. What do you think? If he has this, doesn't he do this? Yes, he leaves the 99 and he goes to seek the one that is straying. So he's comparing that to what he does for us when we go astray. But the truth is that this is how a good shepherd works with his animals. He takes care of them. He cares about each one. And so when we think about animals, they are not nearly as valuable as a human being, but they're still worthy of care. There's this story that Nathan told David in 2 Samuel chapter 12. In verses 1 through 6, David had sinned with Bathsheba. He had her husband killed in battle, and then married her and tried to cover up the sin. But of course, he did not cover it up in the eyes of God. God still saw everything. And God sent Nathan to David. And he told him this story about a rich man who had many flocks and herds. And the poor man, in verse 3, had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished. And it grew up together with him and with his children. It ate of his own food and drank from his own cup and lay in his bosom. And it was like a daughter to him. Now, to some people, they would say, well, that's just ridiculous. Why would anybody treat an animal like that? But David didn't react that way. When as the story goes, the rich man took that lamb and killed it to prepare for a traveler who had come to him, and fed him that pet lamb. And so in verse 5, David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die," or some other translations say he deserves to die, "and he shall restore fourfold for the lamb, because he did this thing and because he had no pity." Well, that's what the law stated. What he says there in verse 6, he should give back fourfold because he stole the lamb. But to David, this was something worthy of death, because he understood caring for animals. Even though he's a very manly man, even though he certainly ate sheep, he ate all this meat, but he still knew about taking care of animals, caring for them, having pets. You can have a pet and care for it and love it, even though you also have to keep in mind that it is not of the same value as a person. But it's okay to have that kind of love for an animal. In Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 10, this is our last passage tonight, but he says, "A righteous man regards the life of his animal, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." If you are cruel to animals, if you abuse them, if you think that having dominion or rule over the animals means that you're supposed to mistreat them and hit them for no reason, and you just starve them and all that sort of thing, you are a wicked person. That's what he says here. The righteous man regards the life of his animal. He's going to take care of that animal. He's going to care about the animal. When we look at what the Bible teaches us about animals, we see that we must never place the life of an animal above the life of a person. Even though we may put our own life on the line for an animal, but we can't put somebody else's life on the line for an animal. We must treat animals with compassion, even though we can still kill them, we can still eat them, but we can also treat animals, certain ones, as special. We can treat them as pets. That is okay. And if we have animals that are work animals or they are pets, if we are righteous, we will regard their life and have pity on them. God loves them. He made them. He gave us the responsibility of ruling over them, but ruling over them does not mean being cruel. If you think ruling over someone means being cruel, hopefully you never become a ruler of any sort, not even a husband or father, because you're going to have a terrible time, and those who you're ruling over are going to have a terrible time. So we must understand what having dominion over means. We must take care of them. Yes, if we need to kill them, we can kill them. It's not a problem, because they are animals. But at the same time, we mustn't be cruel. We must have regard for their life and understand that those who are righteous will care for the animals. All right. Thank you.